Welcome to Watershed Chats, presented by the Water People podcast in collaboration with Patagonia. Watershed moments are traditionally understood as a division or distinction between two phases. They can be turning points that define our shared history. Here, we sit down with experts and those having a go at building and dreaming new ways into fruition for a healthy and habitable future on planet Ocean. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Kabi Kabi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. EMI is a surfer and the 2018 National Geographic Adventurer of the Year. More recently, she was awarded a prestigious Fulbright Fellowship for her ongoing work that explores social and ecological well-being in artisanal fishing villages. EMI's nonprofit, Beyond the Surface International, hosts a suite of projects that use surfing as a tool for social justice, youth empowerment, and sustainable community development around the world. As we're recording amidst social distancing, we caught up with EMI over the internet, so please excuse any dropouts or glitchy moments and enjoy hearing from the founder of Beyond the Surface International. EMI, you recently spent 9 months living in the back of a water sports center called Manta near Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. How and why did you end up there?
It's actually a really funny story because the WSL Pure had organized these worldwide paddle outs for plastic-free seas. This was probably exactly a year ago. And I had been awarded this Fulbright, National Geographic Fellowship. And, it's one thing to write a proposal about I'm going to do this, this, and this. And then actually people are like, yes, we believe in you and here's the money and go forth and do that. And I was like, okay, I got to go figure out where am I going to start? Where am I going to live? What's the first community that I'm going to talk to? And so when the WSL was organizing these paddle outs, I had organized one here in San Diego with actually my graduate school, the cohort. So there was a group of 30 of us, and we had paddled out. But they were going around the world, so I went onto a map and from the WSL and they had a group that went out in Vietnam. And I thought oh, that's fantastic. Maybe I can team up with them because, I would like to surf when I'm over in Vietnam. And it just so happens that the group that organized it was Manta. And they are incredible. It was a very small, water sports center started by this amazing woman, Julia Shaw, who herself is an ecologist, but moved to Vietnam because the Vietnamese government wanted to be part of the Olympics for sailing. And they had basically asked her, she was already working in Vietnam in a nonprofit for, environmental justice, but they basically knew she was a sailor and so asked if she could train a team to participate. And so she ended up starting Manta as a training center for Vietnamese sailors who would want to go to the Olympics. And then because she's, ecologist at heart, she started to hire local fishermen to be sailing instructors. And she was also had this amazing idea to talk about the sustainable development goals while doing that. So these fishermen are not only certified sailing instructors for tourists if they want to come, but they also teach about sustainable development goals, climate action, and how, the power of wind energy as opposed to using fossil fuels. And it also takes the pressure off of them in terms of, providing for their families solely based on fishing, where they have a skill set as well in terms of engaging with tourists, and they're able to earn an income that way. So I had contacted Julia saying oh, I had organized a paddle out in California. I see that you organized one as well for the WSL in Vietnam. I'm coming over. Could I, start off working with you? And I just never left. When it's once I got there, we became, I think of her as my fairy godmother. She's just such a wonderful woman and doing such incredible things with the community. So I lived in a back room. And it's funny because that water sports center, it used to be a brothel. So like all the rooms are kind of situated. So I was living in one of the rooms, and I often thought about that.
So when you were awarded your Fulbright, did you already know how you were going to implement your ideas into the world? Or did traveling to Vietnam reshape what you thought you were going to do there?
Absolutely, traveling to Vietnam reshaped what I thought. And usually when I write a proposal, because my experience before has been writing like grants. And so, and I guess the trick in terms of writing grants is you do have to speak the language of that foundation, or whoever is providing that funding, and you kind of construct this project. But I think with the knowing that of course, because also we work participatorily, and so the community is the one that's going to dictate what happens. And so I definitely put forward sort of like this skeleton, and I knew that the people that I met were going to be able to provide me with those details, because for me it didn't make sense to go with this. I had never been to Vietnam. It wasn't my place to be like, I'm going to go over there and this is what I'm going to do. It was more that like, okay, look at this opportunity that I have, but I'll go, and I just want to like, there's this expression that one of the fishermen taught me in his English, big up. I just want to big up an organization. So whenever we would say like, oh yeah, that could be a good idea, he's like, yes, that would really like, we would be able to big up with that. And I guess that means like empower yourself or speak up. But so whatever I did, I think I went over there with the intention of bigging up.
Yeah. So just to like step back a little bit, you've been involved in so many impactful, meaningful, and very thoughtful initiatives over the last many years, using surfing as a tool for social justice and youth empowerment and sustainable development. Can you talk me through how you came to understand surfing as a tool for these really big ways of working in the world?
Yeah, it definitely was a process, because when I started to engage in this space, I had never, wasn't very familiar with sports for development, like, connecting that link with like an action to then creating like, justice from that. So I originally just sought out to support these organizations that were using surfing as this tool. And when you say a tool for youth empowerment, like empowerment's a word that's just thrown out, quite a lot. And so, but what does that actually mean? And for me, it's relationship building, because not only are you able to supply someone with a surfboard, which is really like a tool to explore this incredible environment. And so what that relationship building does, one, you get closer to this natural space. And so I think when you are done talking about like ocean conservation, when you're throwing out these facts to kids or whatnot who live next to the ocean, it's like now, because they've had that relationship with the sea that's like in a playful sort of free way, that unstructured, wild play, there's like a place for that information to land with you. Like it really hits home. But then for me, surfing with the children of fishermen or local mothers, it also enabled me to build a relationship with the community members, because they would entrust their children in me. I would take them, they would have fun. And so I would come back home, drop the kids off and, alive and then happier than when they left the house. So I think, as a mom, you must understand that like that probably builds trust in like an individual. And so eventually people would invite me into their homes and share a meal with me, but then also begin to talk about issues that they were facing. And originally I was looking at more social issues, but then it became more and more clear to me that because these were all small scale fishing communities and ocean dependent, you cannot separate, the social from the ecological.
So we've been having a lot of cultural conversations around race and racism. And as a white woman of, relative privilege, surfing privilege and otherwise, how did you grapple with the whole white savior industrial complex when you're going into these places and wanting, with a pure heart to empower local people to connect and allow them to have more opportunity, more accessibility to resources. How did you dance that line between, quote unquote, charity work of the past and transforming that into something that is genuinely collaborative?
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because people may have very good intentions, but if you are not aware of that white savior complex, or that community members are going to look at you through that lens, whether it's called white savior complex or not, just the fact that you are white and you're coming in with different clothes and people are going to sense that. And so there's an automatic wall. It may be a wall of niceness where people often say like, oh, but the community's so nice. Well, but I think for me, the way I approached it is, one, just knowing that that is what's going to go on. So no matter, what sort of front I take, it's going to take time and trust for people to maybe let their guard down with me in a very truthful and a genuine way. But that will only happen if I myself am genuine and sincere in every single action. So I always think about going into a community. It's a huge honor. And it'd be like if someone invited you over to their home, and you're not going to walk in and say, like, why do you have your couch there? Or this food is like, ugh. Like you're going to be on your best behavior. It's someone has welcomed you into their home. And it's also in terms of research, when researchers go out into the quote field, and there are community members that are watching them. It'd be like if someone came into your backyard and started poking around your plants, you'd be like, well, what are you doing?
But it's full on objectification, that separation.
Exactly. And so I think I've just tried to be very aware of that and know my place is always as a guest. And that, it's kind of crazy to think that you could just walk into a community and say like, I've got this idea and we should do this, if you've not spent a day living the life of someone who's there. So yeah, it's not something that escapes me when I do my work, but I really focus on being mindful in every action that I do, whether it's picking up a spoon or making a statement, just to always know my place in that way.
Have you spent time, maybe through your studies, critiquing the idea of, quote, charity work? I'm just interested. I feel like it's not a really mainstream conversation yet. And
yeah.
I mean, I'm not thinking so much on the individual scale, but when we think about big multinational corporations who, contribute to the decimation of water systems and air quality, and then they funnel a small percentage of their profits maybe to doing so-called charity work, and that's sort of their guise for doing good work, doing the right thing, helping to reduce their impacts elsewhere. I'm just interested to know, as someone who's studied these things professionally and made a career out of running community projects, how can we reframe the way we think about doing good work in the world?
Yeah, I really don't like the word charity, but I mean, charity has a needs-based approach versus a rights-based approach. So what frustrates me is that the word charity actually goes back to a Greek word, agape, which means love. And it was actually tied originally to early Christians in terms of I guess Jesus's preachings of love and whatnot, but it's gotten institutionalized or structured in a way where I think people use it to feel better about themselves, but it's not changing the structure at all.
The systems, right?
Exactly.
For me, it looks like alleviating immediate needs and maybe important needs, like, providing food for people who are hungry, but not addressing the systemic reasons why those people are hungry.
Exactly. And that's why the charity that exists right now, I think overall in the world, is needs-based. So you're giving people a fish, but you're not going to teach them how to fish. And I think that is something that scares people in a sense, because when people gain rights, it's like, well, my system of power, that's going to shift maybe. But when we're talking about inclusivity and providing a platform for more voices to be heard, it's strange because I think people somehow get confused with thinking that addition will somehow equal subtraction. And that's not it. We're going to be learning new information. And charity also sort of follows this single narrative of history where we're only including certain memories, but not everyone's going to remember the same event in the same way. And so I remember this moment where it really struck me, the standard charity was we were working with a community in Mexico, and there's other organization was there as well, and they had brought, it was during Christmas time, so they had brought a bunch of teddy bears for like the kids. And we were doing a workshop, and so the kids had left the workshop and they were going, it was a photography workshop, and they were going to meet this other group that was there. They had all these white people with teddy bears that were, held above their heads because the kids were jumping up saying like, I want one. And they were kind of struck, I guess, by like the crowd of kids that had come, and they were just holding these teddy bears being like, stop, like stand in line. And it made me just nauseous. And I thought like, okay, and that was just a perfect illustration of, I think, the charity that you're mentioning, where it's, I'm going to give you this teddy bear, and then, I did my good deed, versus I'm going to give you tools, and not even give, I'm going to share with you, because they're not mine to give you. I'm just going to share you with these tools and a technique for you to be able to have the same rights that I have and change the system in that way. So we could do a whole conversation around it.
I know. It's a complicated conversation, and it does make us uncomfortable because it's a fundamental shift in how we've been taught to think about helping other people, reaching out, and it can present major challenges to our ideas of power. And I think specifically of the legacy of surfing imagery of mostly young white male surfers pushing Black and brown children into waves, and how that's been glorified as a kind of charity in a way. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
Exactly. And then you have to think, so what does pushing a little kid into a wave, what does that do for that little kid? I think as surfers, like, we know how surfing has transformed our lives. And so I think if you push a kid into a wave, you then have the responsibility to also be there as a support system to that kid who is going to find some, strength, not only on the inside, but also on the outside. And so then what do you do with that strength? It's like you have to provide the stepping stones also in front. It's not enough just to push, a kid onto a wave. Like, you have to know what you're getting into. Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to paint the picture that, charity is wrong, and that, especially right now, like, we're fundraising to buy food and medicine and oxygen right now. And so, and that will be simply purchasing food and giving it to someone. But, that is in this emergency, this moment. But I'm dedicated to like changing the health inequalities that do exist, especially with marginalized, small scale fishing communities. So when you do exercise your privilege, like, there's a big responsibility that comes with that. And stopping it just there is just kind of sad and a little, hollow, I guess.
That's really well said. Thank you. So you've shifted your work a little bit. I've just been following your journey since we got to spend a little bit of time in India together. Yes. You've shifted to working more in small scale fishing communities, and you've introduced some really beautiful programs for skill sharing. Can you talk me through why you chose fishing villages in particular, and how that relates to surfing, and what kind of skills you're introducing that are impacting those communities?
Sure. So when I first started my nonprofit, we originally partnered, I say we, but it was really just me. I had partnered with three local surfing for youth empowerment organizations. One was in Peru, one was in South Africa, and one was in India, where, we had visited. But it never occurred to me while I was working there that they were based in small scale fishing communities. I had just never made that connection. until my partner, Nico, and I, who we actually met in Lobitos, Peru, which was the first community that I worked with. And it was actually right after working on the film, you and I together, I went back to Peru, was invited for this. It was a participatory audiovisual workshop. And so I think from working on the Beyond the Surface film and working with the kids, and, many of these children in Trivandrum, it's constantly under coastal erosion with rising seas, and it's just kind of wet, and people living in very close quarters, and it's a tough place to grow up.
Major sanitation issues, health issues.
Yes, and many of these children are born without birth certificates. The government kind of just turns a blind eye, and when Dave Holmesy had put these kids on film, for me it was so powerful, because I was watching them watch themselves. We were screening the video, and it was like they made their mark. They are there, recorded in history. And so for me it was like, oh my God, like the power of storytelling and visual storytelling, as a way to even communicate your very existence. And so I was invited to this workshop back in the same community I first started in, kind of like a full circle in Lobitos, and it was being facilitated by this group, Waves for Development, and the facilitator was this guy named Nicolas, and who was using audiovisual tools actually to engage more like indigenous communities in Peru around telling their own stories. So having tools to do that. And
so what does that mean? Like using cameras, using video cameras,
yes,
editing software?
Exactly. Yep. So from like storyboarding to, like retelling of a legend from your community, talking about traditional medicine, and, a lot of these communities that have been, I guess, victims of colonialism and their cultures being wiped out. So he was in the fishing community. Nicolas was in the fishing community, then facilitating this workshop. And so we got to speaking, and I was like, wow, the kids involved in our programs, our surfing programs, like this would be so cool. Because I remember, before even the first GoPro came out, like I had this little Kodak camera, and I was, getting hit by surfboards, but like filming the kids. But then when the GoPro came out, it was so incredible for the kids to film themselves, and they took to it so quickly. So I was coming in it from this perspective. So anyway, Nico and I decided to team up, and so we started under Beyond the Surface this kind of audiovisual workshop series called Coast to Coast. So the idea was we would go kind of visit these different surfing for youth empowerment programs. I still had not made the connection that all these places were in small-scale fishing communities until we were invited to do a workshop with a group in Indonesia. And after the surfing class, we were like, okay, let's try this, a photography workshop where the kids would go take pictures of their community, of the ocean, and come back, and we'd look at the photos all together, and then they would write captions beneath the photos. And this one girl, she came to us with this photo of a woman, her grandmother, who was frying fish. And then the next photo was a plate with the fried fish next to a bed of rice. And her caption below it was, rice and fish are best friends, but fish doesn't come around as often, and rice feels very sad. And
wow,
it blew my mind. Of course, I had been exposed to, to all the ocean conservation, data and plastic pollution. And, I was aware of that as a surfer. But I remember I was reading this caption. I just looked at Nico and I was like, oh my God, like we're talking about food security. Like, and then it was like a flash. I remember like every single instance where I had been pushing kids into waves and there had been a fisherman, or like, it became so clear to me that like, okay, wait, we're already working with small scale fishing communities. We had already been talking about all these social justice issues, but I had never once made the connection that actually these communities are ocean dependent. The ocean fishing actually serves as like a buffer for them in terms of going deeper into poverty, because that you can get food, that many of the fishermen that we work with refer to the ocean as their bank, and they just go out, do a transaction, take their fish as their money, and then come back into shore, and they always know that they can rely on the ocean. But now they're facing these incredibly huge, massive challenges, and they have the least to do with the problem. So that's really when our focus became very, very narrow in terms of being very specific with who we were working with. And then that in that way, we were able to even work with partners who do have, the authorities to change policy and whatnot. But I think for me, it was really a step-by-step process, surfing that led to, using your voice that now you have, built and strengthened. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that caption that gave me goosebumps.
It's kind of like the silliest thing, but it was like,
it made the human connection between the academics of climate change and fish stock depletion and how it affects one girl and her family and her community.
Absolutely. And it's just the most childish statement. And, there's so much power in it. Kids get a bad rep for saying childish things. And I think childish should be a positive, they can really take your breath away with what they're saying.
Absolutely. Having a toddler, we get to experience that almost every day. The profound questions that they have are, like you said, breathtaking. Minnow asked us the other day, what is music? And I was like, and we had to think through that. Like, I felt a real responsibility to come up with an explanation. And he didn't really want to know that, yes, animals can create music and humans can create music. It can be cacophonous, it can be synchronous, but it's just children have a way of re-stimulating our imaginations and our creativity and our sense of play and wonder for the world.
Absolutely. That something that we've come to say to the kids a lot that we work with is like finding the extraordinary in their ordinary, and they're just so good at doing that. Going out and I just have the privilege of like looking at through their photos, insights of their daily lives, and they're just, these photos are just extraordinary. I mean, how they capture even like the light, coming into their house, because that's something that they notice, through the crack in their ceiling, and they really like it, and if you went in with just like the scientific or, academic approach, you would look at that and be like, oh my God, there's a crack in their ceiling. And of course, like, yes, if it rains, like that should, be fixed and whatnot. But, you would never know that kid, really enjoyed the way that the light would fall through the ceiling every afternoon. So I just think these nuances are very important. And again, these memories that deserve to be told and be part of history.
I'd like to read a quote back to you from an interview we did a couple months ago now for the book that I put together, She Surf, The Rise of Female Surfing, which is a shameless plug. So you told me that you wrote, by 2048, it's predicted that there won't be enough fish in the sea to feed the world. 3 billion people, that's billion with a B, the population of China, India, and Brazil combined, are going to lose a staple source of protein, while 500 million people's livelihoods will be eliminated due to fish stock depletion. And I wanted to be really clear when you were talking about the small scale fishermen that were going to their bank, and you said that they had the least to do with the problem. I just wanted to be really clear that small scale artisanal fishing is not the issue that we're talking about here. It's not the problem that's compromising global fish stocks. It's really industrial, mass fishing that is probably the source of where most of the Western world gets our fish from.
Absolutely. So small-scale fishing communities produce 50% of the world's captured seafood. They make up 90% of fishermen, fisherwomen, and most of them live in what I like to call the tropical majority countries. So these are communities that depend directly upon the sea for their livelihoods. And so they are not prone to overfishing, because that would be taking food away from their children in the future when they become fishermen or fisherwomen. So, and just, a staggering statistic is that the US imports 90% of the seafood consumed by Americans. And that is not coming from these small scale fishing communities. That is normally going to be crab or shrimp, and it's going to be imported from places like Vietnam, but that's not coming from the fishermen that, would actually benefit in terms of getting funding from, such a big country to support their livelihoods, but in a sustainable way. So these communities are often in conflict with the industrial boats. Just got an interview back that was translated from an interview that I did with some fishermen in Vietnam, and they spoke about how the industrial boats will just run over their nets. They just either don't see them, but of course the fishermen say, like, how can they not see us? Their boat is so much bigger, they're looking out at the sea, like, of course they're going to see us, but it's too much trouble for them to slow down, so they'll just run over their nets. But then it takes about 2 weeks for them to either mend the net, and that's usually done by their wife, or they don't have the money to buy a new net. In Peru, there's a rule that 5 miles from the coastline is reserved only for small-scale fishing communities, but the industrial boats have either bribed to fish in that area, and there's a lot of conflicts between the small-scale fishing communities. They're just pleading basically with the law enforcement to actually, to enforce these rules. So, yeah, it's hard when you have these communities that are on the front lines, the coastlines of these major issues that we're all talking about, but they often feel sidelined from these big dialogues over the blue economy, as it's called. And they don't see it as the blue economy. They see it as their source of food, like a source of their own culture. The ocean, has everything to do with gender roles, social safety net. It's there are so many ways that the ocean shapes their life, and they often have very little say over its future. And like, the ocean's future is their future, and ultimately it will be our fate as humans on the planet. And so it's absolutely imperative that they have a seat at these decision-making tables. I mean, as of yesterday, that should have happened. And of course, now we're moving towards aquaculture and fish farming and whatnot. And I think one of the things that really surprised me actually in Vietnam is the Vietnamese government, once they saw that the East Sea was being depleted of its fish, because there were a lot of fishing communities and a lot of people depending on fish, they decided to make it easier for fishermen to become fish farmers and transition into aquaculture. But what they didn't anticipate was that none of the fishermen gave up their fishing. What the people that were attracted to the aquaculture, because it was going to be outside where people had previously worked in like textile factories for like Nike, or they didn't want to be inside anymore, so they went out and started doing aquaculture. So in fact, it added more people on the ocean. And while many of the fishermen don't have much conflict or don't really see, they often stay away from the fish farms. Just to, in front of Manta, I had access to like stand-up paddleboard, so I would stand up paddle over to the fish farm, and with one of the fishermen who worked at Manta as a sailing instructor, and we'd have lunch with the guys there. And what always struck me is that they were kind of like misfits of society who kind of found a family on these fish farms, and they would share about their stories. But when we were eating, I just assumed that they would have brought their lunch with them to the fish farm, but they would fish on the fish farm, not in the pens, but they had like a hidden fish farm kind of like underneath the little hut with either like an octopus, or they would put a little fish from the sea in that one. And they would either take their lunch from there, or they would just fish off the fish farm. And so it just really inspired me that like, this is just a part of life, And so when people are blaming, like, well, why don't fishermen just become like tour guides or whatnot? It's like asking a surfer, like, oh, surfing. Imagine surfing is there are too many surfers out there. Like, you need to stop surfing. Like,
yeah, why don't you just surf at a wave pool? It's too crowded, so you should just surf at a wave pool.
Exactly. I think fishing is the exact. A fisherman, a woman who's involved in harvesting and post harvesting would have the exact same reaction. It would just be like absurd.
Yeah, absurd. We often talk about fishermen. But are there many fisher women in the communities that you work in?
Yeah, there's actually there was some great research recently published by this professor, Dr. Sarah Harper, and she and her team were actually looking if they could calculate how many fisher women were out in the world, and specifically small scales, working with communities. And at a minimum, they make up 11% in terms of actually going out and capturing fish. But women play such a huge role in post-harvest, in terms of they're the ones that are mending the nets. They are the ones that are slicing up and doing all sort of maybe the gross work, taking out the guts. And they're also the ones then cooking and feeding their families. And the women that I was lucky enough to interview, who are all at the market and whatnot, many of them saw that activity of selling fish. That was a job because they were, exchanging money and whatnot. But mending the net, all these other activities that are so vital for fisheries, that was just part of their household chores. So it'd be the same as if they were doing laundry. Like, no one's going to pay them for that. So mending the net, why would they be paid for that either? Which I thought was really interesting. And then what's really curious also about Vietnam is that the women are the ones that control the money in the household. So they're the ones that are often either selling the fish, and so they're the ones that are often just, getting the money back. But many of them were asking me, like, in your country, like, who has the money, like, in usually, I had to think about it because I guess it kind of depends on families, but I would assume that the men usually have, more power over the purse. And the women were very excited to tell me, no. In Vietnam, the women have the money. And if our husband wants to go to buy a beer, like, he's got to come to us first and ask for that money, which I thought was just, wow, that's amazing. But, to be fair, like, often women are play an invisible role in fisheries. And so, and many of, like, these poverty alleviating strategies that come out of governments or, the UN, they don't often focus on women. But if women, for the women in Vietnam who are the ones in charge of the, a family's, as a household economic unit, they should be the ones that are included. Like, they should be going to the meetings. It doesn't make sense for the, all the men to go if they're not the ones that are making those decisions. So that was a really interesting insight.
It sure is. So we started this podcast, Watershed Chats, as a way to highlight people like yourself who are in service of solutions. We've talked a bit about the myriad problems socially, ecologically, economically. How can we join you in empowering small-scale fishing communities, surfing communities in a systemic way?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first things that I sometimes share with people is, like, okay, the next time that you go out and eat a fish taco or, order, some sort of seafood, like, ask the waiter where that fish came from, or, like, what kind of fish it is. So just kind of to have this curiosity towards it, because it is important. You're putting it into your body, like, you should maybe know where it came from. Often I think perhaps the restaurant might not even know themselves. Maybe they know where it was sourced. But so to have that sort of curiosity as well towards what you're eating. But if there is anyone who would like to support what we're doing, we are based in the fishing community of Lobitos, Peru. And so we do welcome people to come down and work with us and share a skill that they have with the community that we work with. And then in terms of just, supporting us at the moment, we are raising funding for addressing, the COVID and the impacts there that are having on fishing communities, because many of the fishermen are not able, if they're sick, they're not able to go out and, bring food back or bring funding back. So we do have a donation link going on. But I think what is really, really inspiring right now is to see people who are so actively asking for justice. And I always remember this quote by Professor Cornel West, about that justice is what love looks like in public. And I think it's kind of stepping into that space where you are curious and why is that? Where does that come from? And it's not the love as like James Baldwin says. It's not that of being made happy love, or that he calls it an infantile American sense of being made happy. It's that daring and universal like sense of growth. And so, I would think to ask people to find out what you really love, and knowing that love is also attached to this justice, and going out and doing something with that you have, but something that where you can see yourself, because sometimes we look at the world and we zoom out so far that we can't see where we fit into that picture and all these big global challenges. But I think if you can pinpoint where you fit on the map, if you're a surfer, if that's what you love to do, if you're an artist, if you are a musician, like if you can find yourself on the map, then if you can figure out how to use that for justice, something that you love, it's just the most powerful thing in the world. And so, we're all working for the same thing, which is justice,
Emmy, can you tell me about any firsthand experiences with the impacts of climate change within the communities you've been working in?
We did actually, in terms of looking at climate change, one of the places that we were lucky enough to work in was an island in Indonesia called Morotai, and they're experiencing rising sea levels, at an exponential rate. And in the community that we worked in and lived in, they're already, I think, within the last 2 previous years before we had gotten there, about 15 houses have just fallen into the sea. And so we were very curious to understand, why people thought that was happening. And so we made a short video with one of the local moms. She, did from the storyboard, she wrote it out and whatnot. And it was so fun to make it with her and, record her voice. And so when I asked her, well, why do you think that the sea is rising? She was like, how could I know? But I have a theory that either it's because we are putting too much plastic into the ocean, and so it's overflowing, or that island a couple miles away is dumping too much water into the ocean, and so we've had some animosity towards them over the years, and so perhaps they could be doing that. And so it was I guess I tell those stories because, again, communities that are living on the front lines, the consequences of carbon emissions, and a community that's lost 15 houses, like families' homes, into the ocean, and they just got a road, I think, 6 months before we had gotten there. So no one had a car, they were burning on, wood fire stoves, but it was so infuriating to know that she had not a way to address this, and not even the access to the information as to why this was happening. And
do you feel like that's the crux of your work now?
Yes, definitely. It's been like a 3-step process. Usually we're only in a community that we go to visit. Maybe we try and stay a month, but sometimes just funding wise, we're only able to do it for about 2 weeks, which is why, staying in Vietnam was such a luxury of having that scholarship. But we try and do surfing workshops at the get-go, because that everybody's energy is moving, that trust is built, and then you've got this voice. Okay, so how are you going to use that voice? Let's look at the community's strengths, because we're not just going to look at the negatives. Let's see what are the great qualities that your community has. And so we look at strengths, we look at the changes that communities are experiencing, and then we look at the challenges, and then any of those challenges, have they resulted in any conflicts? And then we've added mindfulness in there at the end, because I think once people do have this call for justice, or this call for action, I think doing so mindfully and non-violently is so critical, because a lot of these communities that we work with, violence is a very real thing, especially for girls. And so to address that with some inner strength and peace, I think is a big deal and a skill to have. So it's this kind of these three tools that we use: the surfing, audiovisual tools, and then throwing mindfulness in there at the end, just to make it holistic.
That seems like a powerful model for any community anywhere in the world. I feel like, have you thought about instituting similar in Southern California? They'd be really useful.
I don't actually, because the lockdowns and border closures, this is the most time I've actually spent in California for quite a while. I'm very glad to be here during this time. Because I do wish that I was with my partner and back in the community in Peru so I could help there. But in terms of everybody seemingly coming to this like racial consciousness, it's been incredible to sort of see what I've been doing in kind of these far remote places, but seeing sort of mirrors with what's happening in these kind of big cities in the US and it's also humbling too, because I've looked at these issues in other places and I'm usually the only one that looks like me, like I'm usually the only white person. And so I haven't really been forced to examine my own implicit biases in a sense, because I have been out of this structure, I guess you could say. So buying the book about how to be an anti-racist and stuff, it's been an interesting time to be here.
This episode of Watershed Chats is presented by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to protect our home planet. Thanks to our sound engineer and musician, Shannon Soul Carroll, and artist-in-residence, Chris Miyashiro. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my co-host, Dave Rastovich, thanks for listening with us. Learn more at waterpeoplepodcast.com.